Now, challenges to an extension of mainstream economics, and there I start with some challenges and the discussion in philosophy of economics. There is much discussion on the foundations of microeconomics, right? You want to understand what's really going on in microeconomics, then models in economics and new branches in economics, and this is then partly already extensions of mainstream economics, and the new branches, behavioral, experimental, and neuroeconomics, and I say a few words on them, and I say more than in later sections. So the question, I'm not dealing with these questions, I'm just announcing the problems now of foundations of microeconomics, because microeconomics, as you all know, uses a variety of fundamental assumptions about individual agents regarding preferences, rationality, and choices, and all these terms are really complicated and full of stuff, right? Full of history and ideas and associations, and partly economics gets rid of these associations by abstracting from some of the content and then forming technical terms. A technical term, what rationality is. So when an economist speaks about rationality, it's a technical meaning of rationality as it's used in economics, right? If you come and you say to your whatever sister, lover, brother, father, but X, this is not rational in the sense of economics, then this person will possibly not understand what you are talking about when you refer to their personal relations, for instance. Okay, and these concepts and their interrelations are therefore important subjects of investigation in philosophy of economics, and I'll do that in section 3, especially about the concept of preference, what's there, and that's highly interested, and this is what I already prepared somehow by the historical story. Then the other one, also a separate section in the class, is then models in economics. And it's interesting here first a historical observation that a century ago economists talked about principles, laws, and theories of economics. So when you read this older literature, you find very little about models. Models is really new today, well, comparatively new. Today, economists prefer to talk about models, and there's a very influential book by Danny Roderick. Certainly some of you have read of it, Economics Rules, the Rights and Wrongs of the Dismal Science, and that book really defends that economics is the science of models. And as far as I can see from my also limited knowledge of other disciplines, it seems that really models, there is no other discipline in which models are so important, apart from, of course, computer modeling or things that directly deal with models. But if you look at the larger disciplines like sociology or psychology, they all use models. I mean, there's practically no disciplines in the sciences anymore that don't use models, climate models, of course. But in economics, the diversity in models is really very impressive. Well, the superlative is not the most important thing in the world, not even in the United States, but it's certainly clear that in economics models are extremely important, and understanding theoretical work in economics necessarily includes understanding how these models work. And we shall deal with the dominance of models in section 2.7 and then with particular models in later sections. And there are many questions that concern the role of models in economics, and I give you a few examples. For instance, that all models in economics involve abstractions and distortions, and of course much discussed also with lay people is the Homoeconomicus assumption, and the question is, what does this assumption really do? I mean, what are the implications? Why is it there? Is that a prejudice? What is happening? Does that import something into economics that shouldn't be there? Or is there a certain image of human beings, the Menschenbild, which is so nicely expressed by some people? I'm rather critical about that anyway. But the question is that the Homoeconomics and many other assumptions, rationality and so on, are there, and the question is, what do they do there? How should such models be interpreted? What is their function? I mean, there are sometimes they have a normative component. Homo economicus certainly has a normative component. You know, that person is egotistic and uses his or her means just for her own purposes in the most rational, effective way. So there's a normative component, and the question is, what do these normative things have to do in a descriptive theory, in positive economics, right? So what's their function there? Does that work? Okay, do these models represent reality? I mean, in which sense does Homo economicus represent reality? Yeah, there are some people who behave like that, but recently Henrich, a well-known cultural historian of economics and economist and so on, he said the best example for Homo economicus are chimpanzees. If you play the dictator game with chimpanzees, once you give them one, they take it and they have no fairness respects at all. Homo economicus, of course, when you play the dictator game, you take whenever it's higher than zero, they take it because to their advantage and they don't care about fairness. Human beings usually don't go below the threshold of 30 or 40 on a scale from 0 to 100. I may say more about if you're not familiar with it. Look it up. It's really important, the ultimatum game. But it seems to be that we human beings are not Homo economicus usually in different cultures playing the ultimatum game. But chimpanzees are. So chimpanzees are the best Homo economicus probably. Anyway, so the question is if these models then if such an idea like Homo economicus is built into an economic model, I mean, what's happening there? I mean, is that a good model or is it a priori a bad model? Why are they doing it? So what's happening there? So these are really questions you may ask. Then the next thing is, of course, how to test such counterfactual assumptions. If you say, oh, you put in Homo economicus, how can you test that this is a good assumption? Or shouldn't you take in a better one? You know, I don't know. Widely discussed questions, then especially under influence of a famous 1953 paper by Milton Friedman. I mentioned it already in the context of positive and normative economics, and we will, in I think 3 sessions or so, discuss that Friedman paper. I think it's undoubtedly an important paper. I think it's also an interesting paper, and we'll discuss it in great detail in section 5. Okay, then another thing is it's less than these possibly distortive things in these models, but also that they are extremely abstract mathematical models. I mean, very often from outside, people are criticizing economics and saying, you abstract mathematical models, what are they capable of saying about reality? That's impossible, right? But they're apparently used for explanatory purposes, and there has been in the philosophy of economics now a long-winded discussion about these extremely abstract models for 3-4 decades. How are they used, and is that justified how they are used? How can such abstract models, very apart from reality, have any explanatory power for real-world phenomena? And if you want to understand how economics works, you should understand that, because the models are there, and you may be happy with them and saying, wonderful, but you may then step back one step and say, wait a minute, I want to understand how can these deliver that good naming an explanation in spite of them being so abstract. And then if you have these abstract models, you have always a variety of families of models, and the question is, can they be tested and potentially even falsified? You know, falsification is a catchword also in economics. I come to it in more detail, that scientific statements should be falsifiable, and then if these models, they are not falsifiable, that looks a little fishy. And the question is, what is happening there? What's their use exactly? Or does that falsification question not come up even for whatever reason? Okay. Section 6 will discuss these questions. And then I come to, you see, it's really ICE, the fast train, because it's overview just to get the landscape, and then we go into the different things, into the details, new branches of economics, and that's a very, from a point of view of a historian of science, a very interesting development during the last decades. Several new branches of economics have developed, and they have been very controversially discussed, especially at their inception. And this is to a degree that really 3 main new disciplines emerge, or subdiscipline emerge, is not something that happens every day in various scientific disciplines. This is really very remarkable what's happening there. And of course, the best known one is behavioral economics, that tries to incorporate elements from other social sciences, especially from psychology. Somehow psychology in weights. When one looks very carefully, recently I read a bibliometric study. Bibliometric study means it analyzes just journal articles, right, and how they interact. And they try to analyze how much psychology literature is really cited in behavioral economics, which is a measure then for the real influence of psychology into economics, and it was surprisingly low. So one has to be very careful with all these things, but Clearly, somehow psychological elements enter behavioral economics, but the question is how much of the professional psychology as an academic discipline. That's an empirical question. Then, of course, experimental economics, also highly interesting, and that insists on the use of experiments in order to gain reliable empirical data. Especially, I talk about that, about causality. So the main thing, the main means in order to gain causal knowledge is by experiments. And this holds for all of science, everywhere. So if you want to have causal knowledge, the best, or the royal road is experiments, and the question is, can we replace experiments somehow by something else in order to get reliable information about causality? The point is simply, and that's a very old, 250 years old, it was seen by David Hume, you can't see causality. You can't observe causality. What you can see is that you have something A and afterwards some B, but you can't see the causality. So I won't do it, so don't be afraid. I smash the window by throwing something into it, and then of course it's the object that smashes the window, it's causal. But you can't really see the causality. What you see is first the thing going into the window breaking, but you do not see the causality. And the point is simply that, and I come in greater detail to that in that section then, experimental economics, if you make an experiment, you can really show as good as it humanly possible that there is causality involved. And therefore experiments are so important, and therefore experimental economics is so important in developmental economics and others, but it's nowadays it's undisputed, I think. And then of course neuroeconomics, the most controversial one, trying to uncover neuronal processes underlying economic acts. So you really have, it's 300 meters from here, you have the fMRI. Down there are 5. One belongs to the economics departments, and they give people, tasks, economic choices, and then they look what's going on in the brain. Very roughly, abstractly, misleadingly, possibly talking. Okay. All right. And these fields are in various ways interrelated, so it's very interesting what is happening in these new fields, behavioral, experimental, and neuroeconomics. And if you're interested in that, you are at Zurich, you are at a very good place. Because really here are many specialists doing exactly that. So it's one of the best places, as far as I can judge, in the world in order to study these things. Whereas in many other universities, they are still institutionally absent completely. So I looked at several German universities and looked whether they have classes in behavioral or experimental or neuro, nothing. And I don't know whether in Economics 101 they talk about it. Are there people who, for instance, have never heard of these disciplines in their undergraduate studies? Have you? Are you all somehow familiar from your undergraduate studies? So who has never heard of these in the undergraduate, say about behavior? Never heard anything of that? Here, yeah, but back home in
maybe neuroeconomics.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah. It's, well, I mean, as an economist, what you know about nerves, the impulses, and fMRI, you know, anything. You say, what shall I do with that? Okay, they shall produce results. Well, we discussed it. Okay, so this is just the situation. It's for an outsider from philosophy of science, it's highly interesting because always very, very many things happening at the same time when new subdisciplines are generated and controversy and everything, and one can study various things, and therefore I think it find it thrilling. And that these new disciplines are not completely outside of economics any longer can be seen from one indicator. It's only one indicator that shows you 3 Nobel Memorial Prizes in economic sciences went to behavioral and experimental economics so far, none to neuroeconomics. So Kahneman for having integrated insights from psychological research into economic science. And Kahneman is a psychologist by training. This is really remarkable. He's the first one who was able to get the attention of the economists. All the criticism, or roughly speaking, most of the criticism voiced from psychology against economics, economists say, you don't understand us, right? And you phrase it in a way. Ernst Fehr told me, he talked about Kahneman and the Fundamental 79 paper with Tversky, that they worked for 2 years just on the articulation of the paper, such that the economist will be able and willing to read it. Because if you write as a psychologist, as an economist, you say, oh, that's psychology, I don't need it, right? And they were able to do that, and it's a masterpiece. Anyway, I will not in this class, not talk about it. Anyway, Kahneman got a Nobel together with Vernon Smith, an economist, for having established laboratory experiments as a tool for empirical economic analysis, so for experimental. And then Richard Thaler, of course, for his contribution to behavioral economics, nudging as one of these important paternalistic or weakly paternalistic concepts, of course. Thaler for his contribution to behavioral, and then even more recently, Berneri, Duflo, and Kermer for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty, meaning experimental approach in developmental economics, and that seems to be by now the gold standard in developmental economics. I've got very superficial knowledge only. But what you see here is that within economics, in the profession, this is appreciated. But a Nobel is not everything, as you certainly know. If you look at the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, that's not everything, and not every Nobel Peace Prize winner will subsequently bring peace to the earth. It was not always successful so far. Okay, behavioral economics I talk about in section 7, experimental section 8. And neuroeconomics is the youngest of these branches, the most controversial one. And some neoclassical economists strictly object to that. And that is also, again, interesting. It has institutional consequences. It seems to be difficult to impossible to publish neuroeconomic papers in the top journals of economics. You may have realized, well, I'm taking also a sociological look at science sometimes, and the sociological look is, for instance, how does a discipline work with journals? What are the journals? So in economics, we have roughly worldwide 1,000 journals. And it's the strictest hierarchy of qualities in journals that I know of. So if you compare that with other fields, it's not that strict. So in economics, it's quite clear what the top 5 journals are and what the top 20 journals are. And for instance, 2 or 3 neo-economists told me it's still impossible to publish in the top 5 journals, right, in economics, with a newer economics paper. And the problem is that some top university ask anyone who wants to become a professor at that university to have a couple of publications in the top 5 journals, right? Which means that the neuroeconomists can't get the jobs in the top 5 in top universities because they don't have these publications. And then the question is, what's the reason for all of that? I mean, what's going on there? I mean, why is neuroeconomics so hated by some classical economists? Are there real arguments? Is there something else? I'm going to discuss these questions. This is, by the way, how I came into the philosophy of economics, because people here in neuroeconomics asked me to look at this controversy because they thought I might have, as an outsider, have a look at it and see things they don't see. They were, not desperate, but it was a difficult situation for the neuroeconomists. They are just not fully accepted by the neoclassicists. Very simple. Okay, discussion in section 9.